everyone, and welcome to another chapter of Science Factory. Today we have Salima Ikram with us. Most of you might know her because she's very famous and a very important Egyptologist, very renowned and very well known by the general public. And she's an expert in mummification process, both of human and animal mummification. And we're going to be talking to her about her expertise and her job. Welcome, Salima.
Thank you so much.
Welcome,
lovely.
Salima.
Thank you. Gracias.
De nada.
So, as I was saying, you're an expert in mummification process and mummies. Is it correct to say mummy nowadays, or is it a bit of an odd term now?
Some people have an issue with mummy, but in fact, it is a very correct term. Either you say sah, which is what the ancient Egyptians would have used to describe a mummified being, or you use mummy because it is a very precise term. And in fact, things that you get in other places should be called naturally mummified or naturally preserved. But a mummy is the body of a human being or other animal that has been deliberately manipulated in order for it to be preserved in a recognizable fashion.
And how did you choose this field of research?
Well, it's just one of the things I'm interested in because I do a lot of work on animals and diet and rock art as well. And actually, I started life as a settlement archaeologist. And it was only because my dissertation, which was on meat production in ancient Egypt, that I got into preserved meat. And then, of course, that is what a mummy is. And I was trying to teach a class on mummies, and I got very irritated because there was no one book that put things together. So Aidan Dodson and I decided I'd do the insides and he'd do the outside. So coffins and sarcophagi were him, and I was mummies, amulets, and wrappings. And so that's how it just started. And it, of course, being able to work with the ancient Egyptians directly is so fabulous that who would say no? So this isn't a great opportunity to be with the ancient Egyptians in a much more intimate manner and get to know them and individuals whom one might otherwise not know because one's always reading about the elite. And of course, sometimes one meets the elite, which is great, or royalty, but a lot of the mummies one does come across are those of people who are not quite as elite. And this gives us an insight into knowing greater sort of social stratification, many more people from ancient Egypt.
Yeah, the other day I interviewed Aidan, so we talked about the book you wrote together. He talked about his side, the job, and now we're talking to the other side, which is a great thing to do. So you studied classical and Near Eastern archaeology and history in Bryn Mawr College.
Yeah,
Okay, and
that's in the States.
And then the master and the PhD in Cambridge.
Yes.
And you're currently a professor of Egyptology at the AUC, American University in Cairo. And well, you have been involved in many projects. What are the projects you're currently working on?
Well, there are quite a few. I'm working on the publication of KV63, which was the embalming deposit. And in fact, it was the last tomb since 1922 to be found in the Valley of the Kings. And that is quite exciting because everyone thought, oh, this is a royal tomb, how fabulous. And then it was not. And I thought, oh, how fabulous. So it was very lucky that I was working with Dr. Chardin, and may he rest in peace because he has passed on, but he also gave me the tomb basically to work on. So, I mean, one of the things, of course, is the publication of KV63. Another thing is I'm working on the rock art of Karga Oasis. So we are recording and documenting the rock art there. And from a site where, you had about 8 sites, we have now got 150. So that's quite phenomenal. And I'm very lucky because I have expertise. I wind up working with a lot of different missions. So I was just in Minya working with Dr. Richard Busman. I work with Mohammed Magahid in South Saqqara, with Miroslav Barta in Abu Sir, and many other missions up and down the Nile Valley, which is great because then one sees so much of what's going on and has a better holistic understanding of what people are finding in Egypt.
Yes, that's a very interesting insight because how do you manage, how do you arrange all these projects that are being carried out at the same time?
Luckily, I'm in Egypt. It's easier. So I teach certain days of the week, and other days of the week I go and I work on excavations.
But that sounds like a difficult schedule to handle. I remember the last time I saw you, you were with Jose Manuel Galan in Luxor. We saw each other in the tickets office.
Yes.
And then it seems like we were following you in the tombs because you were, yeah, we were just following the same path. I was following your steps almost, and yeah, so you were with a group, and you were like doing a study trip or something like that, I guess.
Yeah, we were with our students.
Mhm.
So we were taking the students and we were just doing the West Bank. So they got to see tombs in some detail. And we were looking at architecture and iconography, landscape usage, and, to try and better understand the sacred landscape of Thebes.
Well, about the mummification process, what are the most significant differences you've observed between the mummification processes of various animals species in ancient Egypt?
It is going to be quite varied because they have fur, feather, scales. So it's going to be a bit different for each creature. And in fact, they require different amounts of time to be mummified. Things like fish, smaller fish, and reptiles are easier than mammals. And of course, if you have a shrew, it's this big. But if you have a cow, it's enormous. So, of course, it's a very different way in which you will approach it. So, you have to think of if you have a grown-up cow like the Apis bull, you would really need teams of people working together to work on the removal of the internal organs, to wash everything out. I think people who had trained as butchers might have been quite good on some level as embalmers because they would understand the joints of the body. But and also, if you do a sheep, if you have the fatty tailed ones, that's quite difficult to deal with because we've done experimental work and it was not easy. I have to say, fish, fish are easy. Lizards are great, but mammals are a bit more challenging. But smaller mammals like cats, dogs, not so bad.
Okay, and what is the weirdest animal you have found mummified?
Well, I think the lizards were pretty weird. They are sometimes found, you have a little bit of mud and it's molded, and then they shove the lizard inside and then they close it up. Sometimes they put a lid on it, or sometimes
Mhm.
they just squish it shut. So I think
Mhm.
that's weird. And I think some of the heifer beetles, the
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's.
scarabs, yeah,
Mhm.
are kind of unusual. But you
Mhm.
have things like mongoose, which are associated with Wajet, which is a bit odd because mongoose kill snakes.
Tend to forget that many people that follows us don't really know a lot about ancient Egypt. So maybe it would be good to explain a little bit why did ancient Egyptians mummified animals and they were buried with them and so on. Can you explain us a bit about that?
Of course. I mean, the ancient Egyptians they mummified humans, but they also mummified animals. And there are different kinds of animal mummies. The first kind of animal mummy is um, something we can understand today. Your pet dies and you want to be reunited with your pet in the afterlife. And so then you have it mummified and it waits for you if you die later, or if you die first, the pet is often buried in the courtyard so you can be reunited in the hereafter. Now, the second kind of mummy is sort of a mummy. It's a food mummy. It's preserved food. You want to eat in the afterlife. So mummified meat, sometimes in little cute little coffins, were placed in tombs. And Tutankhamun was a teenager, so he was a growing boy, and he had quite a lot of these, about 42 or more of these food offerings, food mummies, victual mummies in his tomb. Then we have sacred animals. And these are animals that the Egyptians believe that each deity had one animal associated with it. And it started out with the bull cults. And this animal, they believed that you could recognize it by its certain markings. And there, the spirit of the god would enter this animal. During its lifetime, it would be revered. Upon its death, the spirit would migrate to another body, and the dead animal would then be carefully mummified and buried with great pomp and splendor. And the Romans said, oh, this is ridiculous. But I mean, look at it now. You think of the Dalai Lama. It is the same idea. It is the one Lama soul moving from body to body. So these are the sacred animals. And then the most museum, when you go and see animal mummies, most of them are votive offerings. And these are things, instead of giving a statue or a stela, you give actually a mummified animal to the god. And this is the animal that is in the image of the god. And of course, because it is a blood sacrifice, it is so much more precious. And so it has so much more potency and agency. And therefore, you derive more power and, as it were, clout with the god through this bigger gift of a life. And these are what we have in the hundreds of thousands, if not the millions, in fact. And then we have other animal mummies that don't always fall into these groups. So some of them might be viewed as guardians, some of them might be viewed as standing in for statues. There are a lot of these, and they sort of fall under the rubric of other, as in we don't really know.
That's something that happens a lot, I guess. And how has the use of modern technology, such as CT scanning, enhanced our understanding of animal mummification techniques?
CT scans are fabulous because if you do them at the right teeny weeny thicknesses, you can get marvelous slices and you can learn a great deal about animal mummification. We can find out if their gizzards were full of things, if they're birds. We identified one kestrel which had a mouse tail going down its gullet into its gizzard. So it seems to have choked to death, which might tell us a little bit about how it was being looked after or not. We also have been looking at isotopes in order to try and see where certain animals came from, and if they were being bred for mummification in one place or if they were coming from lots of places. And also looking at the diets, what the stomach contents are, has helped us at least have an idea. These are only hypotheses because we don't have a huge amount of data yet. But as the data set increases, we will have a better understanding of using these new scientific technologies about mummification. And so also things like GCMS, gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, we can use to better understand how, what are the materials used in mummification? Do they differ from human mummies? Where are they sourced? So these things, and then also see what is the combination? What is the recipe being used?
And how do you choose a mummy to be CT scanned, for example? What makes you choose one instead of another?
It depends how much money you have.
Good
Then
point.
in an ideal world, you do all of them. Otherwise, what is very wrapped and you can't see, or there's something that looks like an anomaly about it, or if you've done an X-ray, you think we could probably learn some more about this. So
yeah, it makes sense. And about human mummification and funerary practices, what are some common misconceptions about human mummification that you encounter?
well, some people think that there are mysterious powers in the mummification materials, and that if you find this, for example, it's called red mercury, which doesn't exist, but if you find red mercury from a mummy and you eat it, you have power over nature, the sun, the moon, the language of the animals, and perhaps even over life and death.
And
So
does it still happen today? Well, I guess, yes, it
I
does.
still believe that. I still
Yeah,
believe
because
that.
in the past, well, with the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun and so on, well, or in the
First of
past in general, dust of mummy was being sold as
medicine.
healing. medicine. But does it still happen today? It's well,
Oh,
in
I
some
think it
sense.
does. I think it does. Not so much mummy dust, but they're looking for this elusive red mercury. And then, of course, there's a whole problem of the curse of the pharaohs. And so then they're like, people are saying, oh, these mummies, they're cursed. Oh my God, we can't go near them. How dare you? Blah, 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 blah. If the mummies had curses, then the tomb robbers should be dead, but they're not.
Absolutely right. I remember I had once a conversation with a woman. I was traveling from, I think it was from Spain to Egypt, and we had this conversation about having the mummies in museums instead of their tombs. And I tried to explain her that it was impossible to have them in their original resting places because they can't be preserved there. I went for the easy answer because I was not going to give her the long speech. But the public conception or the public opinion regarding mummies is very intense at the moment. I think there are a lot of conversations, a lot of people that have never been really interested in history in general or museums or anything is coming up and giving their opinions about this. And there is a huge discourse about this that it's still impresses me because I've never heard it so much in the past. Maybe in your case, because you've been involved and your profession is related to this, so you have heard it much more than me.
It is an old topic. It is indeed a very old topic, and there have been sort of sensitivities about displaying mummies or what one does with mummies. Even the royal mummies from since they were found, and in the 1920s, there was a big lobby to put them off display, and in the 1970s, they were indeed put off display. But um, I think nowadays in the West, there's more of a sensitivity about it because people are just freaked out by death. I think more and more people just they don't want to be reminded of their own mortality. And I think a mummy does that in a way at the same time as it connects you with the past. So I think people are very much more squeamish, which I find strange because when you look at what's on television or on all the different, whether it's Netflix or Apple TV or whatever it is, there's so much violence. And look at all the video games. So here you want a trigger warning for someone who's respectably dead. And there you are like, let's blow everyone up. It's fine. And it doesn't matter that body parts are raining down around you. So I find it a bit weird that people have this sensitivity and fear of the dead when I think they should be embracing them and seeing what they could learn from them and connect them to the past as well as to other parts of the world.
Or I've never had the feeling that having mummies on display was unrespectful. I always thought it was the opposite. I think it was like very that they have always been shown, or what the ones I've seen have always been shown with respect. And I never had that feeling, but I see a lot of people have that feeling, and it's surprising, as you were saying. And yeah, but it's a topic with no solution. I guess everybody has their opinion, and it's also very difficult to arrange and manage. And
Yeah.
what can you tell us about how social status influenced the quality and complexity of human mummification?
Well, we think it did, but I'm beginning to rethink some of my earlier thoughts looking at more mummies. In general, we have thought that if there is, I think maybe the Egyptians thought sometimes more is better. But if you put more black goo on this resinous substance, it sometimes doesn't serve to protect the mummy, it burns through it. So I think if you just say, oh, if this kind of material is used, it's a very elite mummy, is not an individual, is perhaps not necessarily the case. I think sometimes it's bad quality or bad knowledge on the part of the embalmers. And sometimes there are different kinds of mummification used by people who seem to be of the same socioeconomic class, but it depends on what style they choose or what embalming house they choose. So it's now, if you go to a funeral home, even if you are, supposing you are quite wealthy, you might want to, and you're going to be buried, not cremated, you could either go for the deluxe oak with lavish satin inside. Or you can say, I want to be as one with nature and I want a willow coffin. And yet, for archaeologists, you'd immediately look at the willow coffin and say, this person is much poorer. And the quality of their embalming, i.e., none, is much worse, and therefore they are poor. Whereas if you see someone who has had a lot of chemicals pumped into them and being put into the satin casket, you'll say, oh, absolutely much higher status. So we have to bear this in mind even when looking at the past. Maybe things weren't quite as complicated then as now, but I think we should pay attention to the fact that there's probably more nuance going on and that we should be aware of. Because just thinking that if it's very well preserved, is it always the highest elite? Or is it sometimes what an embalmer was being cheap and actually achieved a better mummy as a result?
But also, it's not only the mummy that gives you the information about the person, it's also the funerary equipment, it's also the tomb itself. So if you happen to know the tomb that corresponds to the
Alicia,
mummy, or the mummy that corresponds to the tomb, it's all together. It's not only the mummy that helps you draw conclusions about it, but it's a whole context
but my
full of
dear,
information. Yeah.
you are talking about this percentage of what we find compared to
Okay.
this. So
Okay.
what we find often are tombs stuffed filled with mummies that have been moved from A to B. So we don't have that lovely, if we were finding only intact burials, great. Then you can do it all. Then you have a sense. Then you've got the equipment, the mummification, the tomb, all of that, and even the location of the tomb. But when you're dealing with just a bunch of bodies that have been stashed away for convenience, then it is much more complicated. And that's what you have most of the time. Or robbed remains thrown every which way over the past, 4,000 or 3,000 years.
Yes, of course, you're totally right. It's only a piece of information and you have to work with that because you have nothing else. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And what insights can we gain about ancient Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife from their funerary practices?
Well, I think the fact that they believed in an afterlife is the first thing we get out of it right from the start of Egyptian history that is recorded. So, in the Badarian period onward, if not earlier, we know that the Egyptians believed in an afterlife because they buried their dead with a lot of objects. And then, of course, subsequently, we know from texts that there was this complex view of getting from this world to the next, the dangers. I mean, it's like a computer game or a board game of you have to go through this fiery gate, and then the serpent will ask you a question. And if you don't know the right answer, da da da. So, I mean, it's like this very complex way of getting from A to B that people had to go through. So clearly, the idea of morality, of being the right sort of person, leading a good life, is inherent in this. The fact that you will be judged if you don't, the kind of judgments that await you, as well as being a bit clever and knowing your religious texts, you know what to say to which god when.
Yeah. And what are the latest discoveries or theories regarding the reasons behind certain variations in human mummification techniques?
Well, I think the is that some of it is economic, some of it is the time period, so it's chronological. It's also depending on where you are, what you might do in the Delta will be different what you do in Minya, which will be different from Aswan. Also, maybe what you have available, or which atelier you go to, which embalming house. So and so does such and such. Oh, I don't think you should go to that person. So, I mean, there's going to be a lot of snobism going on in this as well. So I think that there's still quite a few variations, and also what is available for them to use. Are you going to use some very fancy imported thing? Or maybe there just isn't any in the market when you happen to die unless you've got a stash ready. So if you don't have any, then you're going to go for option B.
You were talking before about how mummies can give us information about the diet. but they can also give us information about diseases, I guess.
Yeah, you can learn so much about the person's history. And if you have a lot of mummies, then it's a whole population if it's, roughly the same time period, which is fascinating. I mean, that's one of the best things you can get is the epidemiology of a population. But you can see what a person's individual biography was. Did they have problems with nourishment at certain times? Do they have cribra or batalia? Do they have Harris lines? Do they have lines in their teeth? If they broke something and it was mended? Can you see if they've had a stroke or if they suffered from cancer or smallpox or TB or a host of other diseases? So, and malaria, schistosomiasis, there are ways of testing for all of these things, not just by looking at the bones, but by analyzing some of the soft tissue. So all of this really gives us a huge insight into medical histories of individuals. And then if you have a lot of them, you can say something. Also with muscle attachments, what were they doing? Were they carrying loads? Were they stooped over in a scribal fashion? Were they hauling stone? All of this. In fact, you can learn nowadays with new technologies. So there was the mummy in the British Museum used to be called Ginger. Now we call him Jebelain Man One or whatever. The after the CT, oh, you were stabbed, you were murdered, and then more looking at UV light, and suddenly tattoos have been found. So each time you take a new technology to bring on a mummy or a preserved body, you find out more information. So, in fact, one can keep reading another page of your biography by using this new technology.
Yeah, it's amazing. And what kind of technologies do you use? You said CT scans, and what else did you mention?
I use X-rays and CT scans, which are the simplest things. And then, of course, when we're looking at mummification materials, if we can get them, FTIR is useful, gas chromatography and mass spectrometry is key, looking at the textiles, looking at dye, things like that. And of course, if you can do isotope analysis to find out where people might be coming from, ancient DNA is less used because it is very complicated and the amount of contamination is extraordinary. Sometimes carbon-14 is extremely useful, particularly when dealing with animal mummies, because we are still trying to establish when these cults really started to be popular, when they might have spiked, and the more C14 dates we can get from the animal mummies, the better our understanding of these will be.
And now I wanted to talk about the current situation of Egyptology and current research. What are some of the most pressing challenges, particularly in terms of preservation and access to sites?
Well, access to sites is a challenge. Of course, one must go through the usual permits here, and sometimes it's with the security clearances, it's a bit harder than it has been in the past. The Lagna Daima remains a scholarly body that does its best. Sorry, that's a permanent committee. And we are there over here. We have more laboratories, so we can do more tests in Egypt, which is fabulous. And I think that, of course, because the digging is so uncertain, I would not recommend a student to necessarily base the PhD just on a dig, because that could be a little bit awkward. So I think those are the challenges. And of course, right now in the world, we are seeing that funding is even more of a challenge than it has ever been before. Increasingly, people are not valuing the past, they're not valuing history. And this is something that one has to combat, because when you lose your past, you will lose part of your humanity. And this is a very dangerous thing.
Yeah, I totally agree. And what are some of the most exciting new avenues of research in Egyptology?
Well, I think some of the forms of analyses are great, and you never know what people are going to find when they do carry out, whether it is analyses of embalming materials or someone was looking at the paints used, and they discovered that the yellow paint on the face of a coffin was in fact higher, expensive orpiment, and everywhere else was yellow ochre instead, because I mean they wanted to use gold, but you couldn't use gold. So you can see the ancient Egyptians really did differentiate about a lot of things. And I think the more we learn about them and the way they were trying to, how we try and figure out their thought processes, I think is fascinating. And of course, each excavation gives us fresh material, fresh insights, and changes how we look at things. Because just studying the mummy of Hui that Muhammad Magahid had excavated, and when I first looked at it, I said, this is no way, this can't be Old Kingdom, this must be much later. Look at the linen, look at the resin, no. And then we archaeologically, everything was Old Kingdom. And then we did carbon 14 and it was Old Kingdom. So there we were, and I have to revise as a result all of what we know about Old Kingdom mummification. So everything that's written has to be thrown out. Well, not everything, but a lot of it. And we have to start again. And then once we found that, then Abu Sir, they found a similar mummy. And then Dr. Hawass and Gisr al-Mudir found a few of these mummies, which before everyone was dating to the late period. And now we're thinking, okay. And because some of these were intact tombs, so you have the ceramics and the grave goods. So now everyone's very excited because this is a whole new chapter and a way of viewing the dead. And then things that previously might have been dated to the later periods, we have to go back and revise that because we probably made mistakes. So, it's been going on for since Smith and Dawson, since the 1920s. So this is the thing, though, with Egyptology, which is so much fun, that one turn of a spade and this entire house of cards collapses.
That must be also kind of, well, it's more exciting than frustrating, but you need to keep your mind completely open in order to be able to accept these new concepts and ideas might appear.
Yes, it is both frustrating and exciting. And, there are moments where you're like, but I love that theory so much. David O'Connor had, when they were digging in Abydos, in the Shunat al-Zabib, there was this thing they found right at the end of the season. And David was like, oh my God, this must be a mound here. This is the prototype for the step pyramid. So everyone was going with this being the prototype for the step pyramid until about 4 years later, they came back to dig it up. And they discovered that it was in fact a lip for a pond. And it was from not the original usage, but a much later usage when they were having sacred ibises around. And so that theory, as this being a prototype, the facts went out the window, but I still think, and so as David said, it's still a good theory. And it's true, it made a lot of sense because you don't just come up with a step pyramid. So there must have been something there. And too bad it wasn't what he'd hoped it was.
And well, thank you very much, Salima, for being here with us. It's been amazing to having a chance to talk to you, and I hope to have you back in some time and maybe to discuss new works that you have been carrying out. And thank you very much again for being with us.
Thank you both so much. It was a complete pleasure.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.